Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining Empower 2021. I am Eric Sugar. I'm the president of ProServeIT. I want to welcome everyone here and thank you for joining our next keynote with Andrea Garson. I'm super excited to introduce Andrea. She's got 27 years, I don't believe that, experience in HR in multiple industries. She's coming to us live from Halifax, and I'm super excited to hear what she has to say about creating a culture of engagement. And I will transition it over to Andrea, and thank you very much for joining us and helping out with Empower 2021.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Thanks for the intro. And yeah, it's been 27 years and 27 great years. So thanks everyone for joining. I realize that I am up against the afternoon blues, the boredom of sitting in front of a screen perhaps for 5 to 6 hours. And likely starting to think about your long commute over to your kitchen to figure out what dinner is going to be like. So I do appreciate you joining, and I will do my best to try and engage you for the next 45 minutes or so. So what are we going to talk about today is understanding. We'll talk a little bit about what employee engagement and culture is. Those are big words, kind of like what is love. So see if I can break that down a little bit and help you understand that. I want to talk about organizational values and maybe get you to think about yours and values-based leadership and what that means. I can talk a little bit about some case studies, which are live. They're the ones that I've worked on in the past, so I truly know what works and doesn't work, and I can share some of the learnings from those. And then because of spending 27 years in the HR field, I'm going to spend a little bit of time and try and cull down what I would refer to as my top 10 list of how to create a culture of engagement. And we should have time at the end. We can certainly open it up and take a look at any questions that you may have. So first, I'm going to ask you a little question that I can't pull you on, but I'm going to ask you to think through what you think would be the best way to describe what employee engagement is. Managers confirm that employees are happy and satisfied at work. The employee survey scores are high in, quote, how happy are you working at the company? A high level of discretionary effort that employees exhibit. Or competitive pay and benefits in the market that create low turnover in the company. So I'm going to pause for a second. I'm going to let you think about which do you feel best describes what employee engagement is. What I can do is I can tell you what it isn't. And employee engagement is not people being happy. And that's often what we will default to is people assume, well, if my people are happy, then they are engaged. First of all, it's also hard to determine if your people are even happy. But employee engagement is not what is happy or people that are happy. So if you picked C, the answer is right around discretionary effort. So the engagement is really the emotional commitment that employees give. And that's the difference between what they have to do and what they want to do on the job. That's the discretionary effort. So you will have a high level of engagement when you have a lot of discretionary effort being exhibited by your employees. So I will note that the employees that are in the not-for-profit sector are really driven by a connection to the company's mission and values. So there's usually a really high passion already for the organization and the job, the colleagues, and the community. So I would say in nonprofit, we already have a reasonably high level of discretionary effort. Not always, but often. Just some of the facts around this is that a lot of companies claim that people are their greatest asset, but when you look at different evidence around that, really 25% of employees are actively engaged, which is really not a lot, right? So we have, in a lot of cases, 60% of employees are not engaged. When we look at UST, which is the Unemployment Services Trust in the US, now it was a report back in 2015, but a lot hasn't changed in that regard relative to evidence. Culture, mission, and purpose are key drivers of satisfaction, especially in the non-for-profit sector. And the bigger the organization, the poorer the communication is from management. So that was the findings in that study that really need to make us think about how important communication is. And then finally, the Conference Board of Canada speaks to the most influential driver of engagement is confidence in senior leadership and the importance to establish trust and communicate the vision. So if you're not gathering anything here, you should be getting the sense that communication is really key to trying to drive engagement. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard the culture eats strategy for breakfast. The question really is, do you really believe that? Do you kind of espouse to that? I did hear something very recently that this is now evolving to the virtual culture is eating our old culture for breakfast. Now, we could spend a whole other session talking about the importance of virtual leadership and how to deal with that. But for now, let's talk about how do we drive a culture of engagement. I will tell you, I truly believe that culture eats strategy for breakfast. If we don't crack as an organization how to have a positive culture, you can have the best strategy. You're not going to get the execution, and you're not going to see the results. So if we, especially for leaders in our business, if we are not waking up and thinking about culture deliberately, you're not going to hit the strategy expectations that you want. So what are values? So here's a couple questions. Again, I want you to really think about it. I'm not going to fly through these, but because I want you to pause and think about it. Do you have company values? I would guess half of you on the call probably will say yes. Do you know your company values? So if I was sitting in front of you right now and said, can you tell me what those are? Could you tell them to me? So think for a second about what values of your company that you already know. So if you know your company values, are they stated somewhere? Could you go to an employee handbook? Could you go to a poster on the wall? Could you go to any other handouts perhaps that you may have received or seen or presentations given where they are stated somewhere? I'm feeling that if we had half of you responding yes, that you have values and probably less than half know them, we're now getting even half of those that can say that they're stated somewhere. As an organization or as a business leader, what are you doing with these values? So think about that for a minute. What do you do with them? Do you do anything with them? Do you ever talk about them? Do you use them in anything in your business? We did a half of a half of a half of a half, and I think we're still at a half of that. I won't bother with the math. And then finally, is your leadership in the organization operationalizing your company values? And that's probably the critical question. And I know if I could see people raising hands, there'd be very few hands right now being raised. And that's not a fault of anybody. That's just what happens because we get so busy with everything else going on in the business. But I want to talk a little bit about why it would be important to be able to answer yes to a lot of those. So values are really a repository, a place, a definition of our aspirations and our intentions as leaders in the business or people driving our business. The concepts that are our values are transcending any context, any industry, any sector. It doesn't matter. Profit, not profit, large, small, any industry, doesn't matter. They will transcend, they apply anywhere. It's really important that we define behaviors that are associated with the values because they definitely will be different by company. They can be different even by department. So when we think about sales execution or financial acumen, perhaps, which are in some organizations values, they may only be applicable in certain departments. So we can even have some behaviors that differ that roll up to define what our values are. So we really want to be able to define what those are. And we have to be explicit. So explicit values we're going to find. So when I went to websites for many of us, either on the call or that are registered today, I went and looked for values. And I didn't go to everybody's because there was a lot of registrants, but I would say less than half was I finding values anywhere on the website. Now, it doesn't mean it just has to be website, but you have to explicitly reflect your values for people to know them. If you want them to be implicit, you're just going to make everybody confused. No one's going to know. There's going to be misinterpretation. So if we just say integrity, that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So we want to be explicit and put them everywhere that we can so people can see them. So in my little research that I did, I grabbed just a couple off of some websites because I wanted to show everybody what I mean by explicit values. So for example, the World Wildlife Fund, I found 7 values on their website, and this is exactly what they look like. And while we read through them, I'm not going to read them all, but while we look at them, and they may be externally focused, they can certainly also be used internally to drive behaviors. So let me show you what I mean by that. For example, concentrating on the most critical issues. Workable, robust, adaptive, and resilient initiatives. Being cost effective and having accountability. Make big wins happen. Engaging. Understanding the broader issues. All of those can easily be relevant to employee behaviors, even though I suspect when this was drafted, it was externally focused. Let's take a look at another one. CS, clearly stated values on their website. Challenge the status quo. Achieving or surpassing all of our goals. Committed to financial stewardship. Always delivering results. One voice with common goals. Building strong relationships. An encouraging and supportive environment. Again, may have been drafted externally, absolutely applicable internally when we think about making decisions and driving behaviors in our organization. Third one, Fort White. Very clearly stated, again, on their site what their guiding principles were. Connecting and understanding, educating, evolving, and empowering for change, inspiring people to make meaningful change, connecting with each other, respecting each other, embracing diversity, acting with integrity, honest and authentic. Same thing. So you see in the pattern, we can define behaviors that are important in our organization. And if we haven't done the exercise of thinking internally in these organizations, it applies both. And I'll give you one more, Microsoft. This is how they state what's important to them in their organization. So meaningful innovation, driving diversity, sustainability, AI, building capabilities, sound business practices, investing in our people. Okay, so I think you get the idea. Explicit values helps us make sound decisions and drive behaviors in our organization. So that takes us to values-based leadership. So when we have explicit values, really decision-making becomes much easier. So when you're not sure what to do, you hold that mirror up to your face. The answer and the choice becomes pretty obvious when we know what's important to us in our organization. So if we live and we lead by these values unwaveringly, without exception, particularly when they're tough to stand by, you have an organization that is all marching to the same tune, that understand what's important. We're not wasting time on non-essential issues, and it's like magic. So I'll just give you a quick example of this unwavering focus on values-based leadership. When I worked in the car industry, and that's not picking on it, it's just an example. I worked in the car business, and we didn't have values when I first joined. Well, we didn't have stated values. We did have values. So we did the exercise and developed our internal values, put them up on the wall, communicated to everybody. And of course, integrity was one of those. And shortly thereafter, we became aware of a salesperson who had stolen gas cards from us. And it had also become aware that he had done that in the past, but we didn't do anything about it. We sort of slapped him on and said, you can't do that. The reason was this was our top sales guy. So it was very difficult to give up the revenue and have our sales guy leave us. But when we found out about it after communicating to everyone what we mean by integrity and what matters to us, we didn't have a choice. The leadership didn't have a choice, regardless of him being the top sales guy and whether or not the next car dealership was going to pick him up and get those cars sold over there, had to become secondary to what matters in the company. And integrity matters. He lacked integrity. The answer became obvious. But without that, without those staring us in the face, it's easier to hide behind them and not do something that's tough. So that's an example of the unwavering commitment once we have them. Okay, but the decision's easy at that point. There's no debate. We know what we need to do. So basically, values-based leadership can create this framework that not only is going to guide decision-making, but it also gives everyone an internal compass and a connectivity that's important for people in any organization. And keep in mind, it's very synonymous with why a lot of people are drawn to work for not-for-profit in the first place. So hopefully there's already some inherent values-based leadership decision-making that happen in your organization. Let me take you through a couple of examples, live examples. So I was the head of HR for Workopolis for 4.5 years. And when I first joined that organization, we were 75 employees. We were owned by a large newspaper, and we had no programs, policies, practices, and certainly no vision, mission, and values. So, as I said, owned by the newspaper, everything was on a spreadsheet. We didn't have a sick leave policy. We didn't have any career planning. So it was harder to attract and retain great talent. And we were growing. In the 4.5 years I was there, we went from 75 employees to 400 employees. So we were on a growth trajectory, but we didn't have any infrastructure. So the first exercise was we met with all the employees that were there at the time, and we found out what was important to them and what mattered to them. And through those exercises, we came up with what we call the Workopolis Promise, which listed our mission, vision, and values. And from that, we then began building all of our people programs. So, for example, we didn't have a performance review process, performance management tool. So what we did is we looked at what people were expected to do on their job, and I call those the what's, and that would be individual goals and objectives. But we also looked at how they did their job. So it's not only what they did, but how they did it. And then what you can see listed here are the 5 values that we had come up with in our Workopolis Promise. So as an organization, when we did a performance review, we weighted the what's and the how's both at 50%. So when employees got a score at the end of their performance review, it was not only what they did, but how they did them that mattered. And we had clearly defined behaviors associated with each of them. So that's one example of how you apply the values to it. We then created a whole bunch of other programs as we continued to grow in the organization. So we launched an employee survey, which we call Work Opinion, and I will share some of those results in a few minutes. We also launched an education assistance program for employees that wanted to continue their education. We created a referral program because we had great employees and we wanted to make sure we got more. So we would compensate employees when they made a referral to some that we hired somebody else. We offered an exercise wellness credit. So it didn't really matter. First, it was a gym membership we started out with, but not everyone goes to the gym. And in some parts of the country, they didn't have certain gyms. So we extended it to just be a credit. So they could go buy a Wii Fit. They could go, we had people submit for horse saddles because they had horses and they used that for exercising. So we gave a credit for health and wellness. We created an intranet so that employees could go and find information locally. And this was all feedback that had been given to us based on how they could engage with us further. We created a careers wheel to help people navigate through the different career opportunities at the company and what skills they needed in order to be able to advance into their jobs. And we also created a recognition program called Workignition. You see a theme there with the Worko. But that was not only to recognize years of service, but also we would recognize employees on a monthly basis who exhibited the values. That's it. It wasn't the top salesperson. It wasn't the person that stayed late. It was those that exhibited the values, and it was all peer recognition. They would nominate, and we would, as a management team, review it on a monthly basis and select those that we really felt exhibited the values. one thing that we were able to do, and this was back in 2010, Workopolis was actually the sponsor of the Olympics for 2010, one of the sponsors. So in that rollout of a recognition program, we were able to provide our top guys, our top folks, trips to the Olympics for them and their spouse. So we took our top 8, I think they are, or 7 or 8, and you see them up in the left corner there. They were awarded based on exhibiting the values. And I could tell you, that was it's a risk, because people in the company will say, well, why didn't I get to go? But it was so obvious when they were selected that everyone else in the company just got it. They're like, yeah, absolutely, they're the right ones. So I don't expect everyone to take employees to Olympics or those such large events. We just had that option. But the point was, they were recognized for exhibiting the values and rewarded for them. Over time, and as I talked about these transcending time, we went through leadership changes at Workopolis, and we would change our vision or mission or adopt it or make modifications to it. Our values could even be redefined. They often were similar, but we may have described them differently. And here we wanted to have a theme around time to shine. So we came out with words around shine. But they continued to live on through different leaders and through different expectations we had in our organization. One thing that I was really pleased to see is that when we had our strategic objectives, so as an executive team, when we set out to the company, here's what we have to accomplish in a particular year, we had living the promise on there. That is living the values. So not only is it up there, it is front and center in organizational conversations at the leadership table on how are we going to live the promise. So what, you may say? What's the point, and what do you get from doing all this? So in our employee survey that we did it for 3 years in a row while I was there, 100% participation 3 years in a row. And I can tell you, that's not easy to get. I did bribe people with chocolate chip cookies, but we had 100% participation. And the results told us this: 85% or more favorable scored, I would recommend the company as a great place to work. I feel proud to work at the company. Cooperation and teamwork. I understand how my job contributes to the goals of the organization. The company takes a genuine interest in the well-being of its employees. I work with very competent people on a regular basis. We continuously strive for excellence, and I'm aware of the company's overall strategy. 85% and above favorable on all of those questions 3 years in a row. And that yields us, we had less than 9% voluntary turnover on a year-over-year basis. We kept all of our key talent, and we had defined key talent very clearly, and we maintained all of them over the period of time. And at least 25 to 30% of our hires were referrals from internal folks, which is also a good sign, because again, if we keep good people and are happy with their performance, we want people like them to join us as well. And then even externally, the company was recognized. We received some awards for our culture over the years. So the whole point to that was to just share that if you're deliberate in your approach in building a strong culture, you can get results from it. So I did want to test myself and find out, did it only work at Workopolis? Like, were we lucky there for some reason? So I went to the auto industry and I said, I'm going to do this all over again. I'm going to start with building the values, and we're going to see where we go. So I'm not going to take you through the whole exercise again, but what I will share is that, again, we created, in this case, 6 values, and you can see oftentimes they're similar across organizations, but we may define them differently. And the results, again, spoke to themselves. So we did employee surveys year over year, and these were the categories of which we had multiple questions in. And year over year, we had, in that particular example, we had every score go up on the positive, and our reds, our negative scores, our constructive scores went down. Then I went to the healthcare industry and took a look at it again. So we already had values at Cardinal Health. We did not have to create them. They were well embedded because it's a international organization, well-oiled, but we weren't really doing anything with it. So again, we went through the communication, ensuring that people were focused on them, and we measured it again. So we have 3-year trends here, and you can see in the final year, we had positive scores in these 4 categories, and again, multiple questions under each category, positive scores going up. So I will take you back to that statement. Culture, will eat your strategy for breakfast if you are not deliberate in focusing on how do you build that culture. So I want to now switch to my top 10 list of creating a culture of engagement. And I will start with goals. It is very important to have goals for the company and for employees within the company. This is my daughter's, so within my own family company, she has a goal to visit all 30 Major League Baseball stadiums. And so she has them all laid out, knows exactly where she needs to go. So it doesn't matter what, I guess it does matter what the goals are, they have to be relevant goals, but have to have goals in your organization. Employees have to know what the company goals are. And then you have to transcend that down to them, and they have to have their own individual goals that they can be measured on, and that they can see a difference, and that they know how their goals will relate to the company goals. Very important to have. Number 9 is execution. So execution of those goals. So what you actually see on the wall here is she had made for herself each of the different leagues, baseball leagues, banners where she can hang lanyards, because that's what she collects when she goes to a major league field. She collects lanyards so that when all of these pegs are filled, she's achieved a goal. So she's measuring the execution of her goals. Incredibly important in any organization. If we are focused on having goals for individuals, we have to make sure that they are executing against those goals. We're measuring them, we're communicating their successes or where they're falling short, we're having those conversations. But if an organization does not execute against the goals, not only is the organization not going to hit the objectives, but individuals are not going to feel like they are valued and contributing to the overall cause. Number 8, we have to have courage and resilience. So to go back to having the values and values-based leadership, it takes courage to make the tough decisions, and we have to be resilient and focused on sticking to that. So there will be people on the team, there will be employees, there will be leaders, there will be managers that are not going to want to make the tough decisions. And the tough decision can be a full gambit of issues. It's not just, should we fire them, should we keep them? It's in everyday execution. You have to have the courage to make those tough decisions. Number 7 is humble. So as organizations and leaders and business folks in our businesses, we have to have humility. We have to admit when we make mistakes. We can't be afraid to speak to it. And the best thing we can do is talk about how we learn from our mistakes. But if we have the arrogance and somebody who is bigger than everyone in their inability to be able to admit when they've made a mistake, you are not going to have alignment and engagement and fellowship that you need in any organization. So we all need to have some humility. I am going to put this back up one more time because I would say that deliberate focus on our culture is important. So we can't assume, especially in our not-for-profit environments that we may work in, that passion for the cause is going to automatically create engagement. We're going to have to be deliberate in our approach. Number 5 is recognition. So I would say in a not-for-profit, recognition is needed far beyond pay, because as we know, oftentimes it can be lower in not-for-profit than in other organizations. So other things that you can think about, though, would be around flexibility and work-life balance. I think that's really important, especially in this sector, because of the population of employees that are coming to you can sometimes be in different places in their life. So there are other ways to show recognition beyond just pay and benefits, flexibility, the programs I shared with you. Some of them don't have to cost you anything. I've done recognition programs where we create postcards and people can share recognition just on a postcard, and it doesn't cost anything. But deliberately thinking about how do we recognize execution against goals, exhibiting the values, and alignment with the cause would be very important. Number 4, it's always hard to know exactly where to put fun, but I would say it's definitely in the top 10. You have to ensure that there's some fun in any company. So I'm going to share the example. This is an ice cream truck. That's actually me in the ice cream truck. So back to the car business as an example, in the middle of the summer in Toronto, when the weather is 40 degrees and the cars are being worked on in these large bays with the doors open. It is so hot. And we always felt for our technicians. So one day we decided to bring an ice cream truck in. And instead of having the vendor drive the truck in and serve the ice cream, myself, and this is actually the general manager of the dealership, we hopped into the truck, we had it driven around to the back, and we had a lineup for the ice cream to be served. There we are, trying to figure out how to serve the ice cream. There's a happy employee eating his ice cream as he gets to have a break from the heat. And there's my poor attempt at building an ice cream that just flopped right over. But the point is, we understand the circumstances under which those employees were working, and we thought we would alleviate that for even a half an hour and have some fun in the workplace. And the cost was so minimal. And the impact, they still talk. I go back and visit them, they still talk about it. So have some fun, and don't be afraid to. Know thyself and be true to thyself. It's another way of understanding what your internal values and what's important to you, and making sure that those are aligned with the organization. And that's how you have engagement in your company, is when your internal values are aligned with the company values. Because then there's no distress, there's no confusion, there's no moral compass that's not aligned with you and with the company. So oftentimes we just have to take stock of what our own internal values are. And if something feels amiss, you're going to know it. You'll feel this disconnect happening internally. So I would encourage leaders, and I would also encourage all employees to be sure they're thinking about this. And that's why creating your values for your company in the first place is really important, to include employees and not just have top-down leadership make a decision on those. Engage everyone to understand what's truly important to them. Communication, I referred to that earlier as well. We cannot communicate enough in any organization. And especially when we want to talk about the values, when we talk about the goals, when we talk about execution and results and success and challenges, communication is key. I think we've all learned that more than any time this past year, on how can we continue to communicate, especially in our virtual settings if they weren't already virtual. So those 3 words, we heard you, got to be my most favorite words in 27 years of work. When employees share feedback to you, oftentimes whether it's through an employee survey that you do, or they are just telling you what's important to them, when you make a change in the company, to be able to refer back and say, we heard you, and this is why we're making the change, really helps them connect the dots that you listen, you care, and you do something about it. So the more you can say, we heard you in your communications, use those words. They're powerful. And finally, my number 1, I don't know if you can guess it. It's something I haven't said. I've referred to it, but it's trust. If you don't have trust within your organization, whether it be amongst the leadership team, whether it be amongst employees, whether it be with customers, with vendors, with suppliers, with donors, whatever it is, if they don't trust you and you don't trust them, everything I just said goes away. So I'm going to, at this point, pause, and we will turn it over and see if there's Q&A that anyone would like to share. So I see there's one question around have the ability to get the PowerPoint presentation. I'm happy to share that. I think I can send that into the company and they can get that out to you guys. Another question, any tips for avoiding gobbledygook when creating your guiding statements like values? So they're often loaded with meaningless words. I completely understand that. I think the tip is clarity and conciseness, which should be first and foremost in any of your communications. But when you have, let's just take integrity. We talk about that a lot. If you use integrity as one of your values, you need to just give specific examples of what the behavior looks like. So if you stick to that mantra of behaviors and defining those, you probably won't have gobbledygook. But if you describe a value and at the end of it you go, yeah, no, I don't really know what that looks like, then you're at the gobbledygook time and you got to rewrite it again. So I would use a litmus test. Can I evaluate somebody against these words? And if the answer is no, then it's defined as gobbledygook. Will this session be available after the conference? Oh, so yes, we'll make sure that you have the slides available to you. What was the number 10 on the top 10 list? So we'll really quickly just kind of scroll back up to that and make sure it was goals. So having goals, and of course the next one was executing against those goals. How do you transfer trust when leadership changes? So I don't think you do transfer trust. I think everybody, every person has to establish and build their own trust. So hopefully the trust within the organization won't be affected by the leadership change, but that new leader has to come in and build the trust both with and for that organization as well. So it's not something that, it's not like a lottery ticket and you just sign over and transfer it over to somebody. You have to build it individually, would be my thought on that. How do you face burnout with employees and even more leadership? So burnout is taking on all kinds of different looks now, aspects now, especially with the virtual. You know, people just get burned out staring at the screen all day. But I think it's a combination of ensuring that people have meaningful work and that you are helping them grow and develop in their roles. And you're talking to folks, because oftentimes what you're seeing is company will put as much responsibility, pressure, and expectation on employees that you're willing to let them put. So employees are going to have to put up their hand and say, sorry, I can't do that anymore, or sorry, I have to go home now, or I have to go pick up my child. So as much as a company can try to create roles and expectations that are within our capabilities, it's also up to us as employees to be able to share and communicate back when we can't meet those, or we're burned out, or we're tired, or have no balance. When I was working, and I was VP of HR for multiple companies, I always had a rule that I didn't attend a meeting after 5 o'clock because I wanted to go home and have dinner with my child. That didn't mean that I wasn't necessarily logging back on again at 8 or 9 at night because something had to come up. But unless it was an emergency, I had my boundaries. And that was one way I managed burnout, because to me, if I don't see my daughter at dinner, I was pretty stressed. So I think we own it as much as the company owns it. At the beginning, in what culture of engagement, what weight would you place on the employer's creating space for the employee to do self-directed work? So I do think that providing a space for employees to learn is really important. And you're seeing more and more organizations allocate a specific amount of time a day. And I've seen up to 20% of a week to be allocated to self-development. That's very high. And that's often in technology companies where they have no choice for these employees to stay up to date and learn. But I do think it's really important, especially when you're trying to engage even the newer generation, when learning is very important to them. I think creating some space for them, whether it be a certain percentage of the day, of the week, or kind of giving additional days off with the expectation that that's what they're going to do, might be helpful. How do you emphasize values-based systems when things in the not-profit sometimes can get all hands-on-deck situations for higher-ups? So every company has all hands-on-deck. And there's no question that every organization, and I hear you, in the nonprofit can easily be sort of all hands on deck. That shouldn't have to take away from your values, though. So if we truly believe that we've got the right values and we want to live by them, there are still ways that doesn't preclude execution of work. And oftentimes you'll see results driven being one of our values. So I think what we just have to make sure is that as business leaders or in an organization where there's a lot of expectations put on us, we still have to make sure that we are doing it right. So remember my what's and how's. You're talking about what's and getting things done. We just want to make sure we don't forget about how we do that. And sometimes that can get lost when we're so busy. But we need to have that transparency with managers and say, I'm not feeling trusted, or I'm overwhelmed, or whatever is happening. So oftentimes things just go back to communication. Would I be able to show my contact information again? I can definitely do that. So there you have it. I will leave it for a moment. In case anyone has any questions on what I spoke about, I'm happy for you to give me a call or send me an email. So I'm asking for a quick top 10 review again, but I think maybe we'll leave that because you will get a copy of the slides, so you'll be able to see them. Oh no, it starts with this may be a loaded question. How do you address the generational gap in defining values right now, with professionals recently entering the workforce, bringing certain expectations on equity and inclusion, and more tenured managers juggling learning and embracing the challenges? No doubt about it. I don't know that I can tackle that in 2 minutes or less with a very concise answer, but it's not just a generational gap. This whole world is changing, and so much has evolved in the last few years with the different movements that we've had, the political landscape, and then of course with the pandemic. So there are different styles of leadership and different focuses based on different generations, without a doubt. Most important though is not trying to change everybody to think the same way. It's helping each of these generations and each of these different approaches to understand each other. And there's all kinds of ways we can do that, but I would probably focus mostly on learning and development or training. There's all kinds of avenues where we can come in and speak to organizations. You can hire oodles of trainers, but they can help different people see a different perspective. So it's more about educating and helping us understand each other versus trying to force one to think like the other. We're in the process of reviewing our vision, mission, values, and goals, but it's taking much longer than expected. How long does the process take? Yeah, there's no easy answer to that. I wish we had a book that would just tell us that. It really depends on how aligned the organization and the leadership are, and how far you go in requesting input from employees, which I highly would recommend you do. But it doesn't have to be arduous. If I just think back to my examples, it probably took us from start to finish 2 to 3 months to get everything done and have it all ready and delivered and ready to go. But that's because we were focused on it. There are other priorities often that take over. But if somebody is accountable, if you set a goal and hold somebody accountable to execute that, which we talked about as being important, then it doesn't have to take too long. How do boards get an assessment of the culture within the organization? Yeah, it's interesting. I find board leaders, I also find CEOs, presidents, they have a perspective on what the culture is. And when I contact them, they'll tell me what their culture is. But that doesn't mean that's what the culture actually is. So they may manifest what they want it to be or what they think. And they may be right, but sometimes they're not right. So one of the most objective ways to do is to do an employee engagement survey. And you can do that as simple as a Survey Monkey, as long as you keep it confidential. Or you can hire organizations that do surveys for you. But that way, if people can comfortably, it's not because it has to be anonymous, but people tend to be more transparent that way. If you can do a survey and gather the data and then present the results in an appropriate way to the board, that helps give them some objective views on what the culture is versus simply polling and asking people what they think, because it matters. So there are ways to do it. I encourage you to do it that way, and anonymously tends to be the best. How do you keep engagement during negotiations? And it's challenging. I'm not sure what we mean by negotiations and in what organization. It may be hard for me to manage that, but if we're talking a union environment, perhaps, I'll just make a guess and answer that, and you can contact me directly if it's not. Negotiations in contractual environments can be challenging, but I would go back to respect in the workplace, and no different than how you're going to treat anyone on a regular basis. Is you still have a common goal, still have to come to an end result in a contract or an agreement in the negotiations, and sometimes we may just have to remind everybody, if we actually have explicit values, bring them and put them on the table, put them up on the wall, and let's remind everyone to engage in them. Let's see. Sorry, self-directed as employee lead projects and initiatives, not self-improvement. Sorry, I don't know what that's referring to. I'm going to have to skip that one. Is there a shift in assessing values? If there's a shift, does that typically start with leadership evaluating things from the ground up? So a shift in assessing values. I assume what we're asking for is wanting to recreate or create new values in the organization. I actually would like to see it as sort of holistic. So it's hard to say it's from the ground up, but if we're finding that a lot of behaviors with the current values that we have are not being exhibited, or they're being challenged, or we're making changes with people and processes all the time, it's probably because we may not have the right values. I actually worked with a client who had stated her values and was really pleased about how they looked, and creatively they were very visually, aesthetically pleasing. But when I got to know that organization, she was missing some key values that that resonates with the entire organization. So it's okay to evolve them over time, especially if things are changing in the company. And it's probably a good idea. You want them to reflect what's important in the business, and that can change. So it's okay to make a shift. I think you want to then go back to, we heard you. So hopefully somewhere along the way, there was some information, whether blatant or not, that caused you to make that change, and you can use that as the basis for why you're making the change. How do you emphasize value-based systems when things in the not-profit sometimes can get we already did that one. Okay. How do you engage negative employees in the values of the organization and not influence other employees in a toxic way? Again, we'll probably have a 2-hour conversation about it. And it really depends on negative employees and what our values are. So sometimes there's a difference between employees that don't understand what their work is, aren't aligned with the company values and goals. And then there's just some folks that just don't align well with what our organization stands for. So it's a combination of, back to the courage, we probably want to have the courage to make some tough decisions if we truly have people that are influencing them, I'll use your words, in a toxic way. Toxicity is not a good thing in our organization, and we are going to have, that's where the courage comes in. I want people to be strong enough to recognize that, have conversations with those employees, and show them, give them specific examples of their behavior. What does it look like that they are not aligned? So show them and tell them what it is they're saying and doing that's causing this. If they can't get it, if they can't readjust their behaviors, then we got to make some tough decisions. How do you prevent employees from feeling that employee satisfaction surveys are leading? There's a lot of skepticism around employee surveys. And what I've learned over my 27 years is it's not the surveys, it's what leaders and companies do with the results of the survey that is the problem. So if we have the right questions in a survey that are truly getting at understanding what's going on in the business, and they range all from people's jobs to the environment to the safety to their managers, there's all kinds of aspects that we want to survey. But if we have the right questions, and that's why I said earlier that confidential surveys are, I think, the best, because as long as people believe they're confidential, and that often takes time to convince them that it is, then hopefully they'll share with us exactly how they're feeling. But it's what comes next that's more important. So more often than not, companies will do surveys and then nothing happens. Employees never see the results. We never talk about it again. Some people often will get fired maybe because of what was said in there, which is not the right approach. And then we just do it again next year, and employees go, well, why would I bother? Nothing happened. I didn't even hear about last year's. So there's a really thorough process that we can go through with employee surveys to communicate back results, to set plans to make change, and then to hold people accountable to make those change, so that when we survey again the next year, we can see hopefully a change from year to year. So it's more about what we do with the survey versus the survey itself that will matter to employees. What do you consider in creating values? It really boils down to what's important to this organization. So again, especially in the not-for-profit, that's already defined in so many ways, and you can capitalize on that for your internal values. But if you're starting from scratch, it's really about what does the leader stand for? What does the company stand for? What do we want to exhibit to customers? What do we want them to think about when they interact with us? What does it feel like to them? And that's often where the values will come from. I know that's very simple, but it's a multiple day discussion usually, but that would be the basis. Okay, we'll take a couple of more. How do you create that culture of transparency between management and employees? I can't say the word enough. Communication. You talk and talk and talk all the time, so that eventually employees will trust you and believe you. But if oftentimes we're not seeing that, you don't see an open, talk about an open door policy, but my door's shut all the time. So it's not really an open door policy. So creating situations where employees feel that they can come and talk to management, that when they bring forth a concern, that's a legitimate concern, that management does something about it. When we don't, when they just talk about an issue and nothing happens, that's where you're going to lose that level of transparency and trust. So I know it sounds simple when I say communication, that's a big word again, but the more open communication that you can have, share results with the company as best you can, talk about where we're succeeding and where we're failing, give them updates, let them know what's concerning you, what's keeping you up at night. They'll start to trust you, and there'll be more transparency. How about we take one more question and then let you guys get ready for your next session. I'll take this one. Can you speak about how to manage up when leadership isn't displaying the values that they proclaim? That's a really tough one, right? So it's one thing for us to hold people accountable in the organization, but when it's senior. So depending on who it is and where our level of trust is, you want to be able to start having that conversation. Ideally, you can have it with your manager, who then we can gradually escalate it up. If there's an HR department, you can talk to somebody in HR that can help you have those conversations. If you have the ability to go right into that senior person and have that conversation, and it's simply stating that you're seeing something that they may not see, and help them see that, give them that example. They may not be open to it, but then it becomes an issue of they're not living the values. And that's where I go back to the know thyself and be true to thyself. If it becomes something that is so important to you, which it should be, and you're not seeing the leadership in the company exhibiting that, and you've done what you can to try and help them see that, then you have to think about what's most important to you. Okay? So it's not an easy one, but I would encourage you that oftentimes, and that's where I've gotten to play a role with some of my clients in the past, is that nobody will go to the CEO and tell them that they're sometimes the problem. So I get to play that role for them in that case. So, but they would value that feedback. It's just usually people don't have the courage within an organization to give that feedback. I would encourage you to do it. I think we will leave it at that, if that's okay. So I'll give you guys a few minutes to get to your next session, but I really appreciate your attention, and these questions show that you really care, which is really what it's all about. So thanks everybody, and I wish you all a really great rest of the day.
Thanks very much, Andrea. Really appreciate your presentation. I love the top 10 list. Again, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you for sharing your time and your knowledge, and have a great afternoon, everyone. Look forward to seeing you at some sessions later on in the day.
Bye, everyone.